Hey everyone, it's Jamison Cable of the Land Between the Meadows, Kentucky History Podcast. I just want to say thank you for your support and listening to this episode. For all the updates on our podcast and YouTube channel, youtube.com/Kentucky History Channel, like and follow us on Twitter and Facebook at KY History Pod. If you're enjoying the podcast, give us a good rating and review on Apple Podcasts or the podcast platform that you're listening to. If you're looking for ways to support the podcast, an easy and simple way is to share it on Facebook or any other social media and tell your friends. You can also go to audibletrial.com/KYHistoryPod and get a free book of your choice. And finally, you can visit patreon.com/KYHistoryPod if you want extra content from us. If you're already a patron, thank you for your support. It means so much to us. All the links I've mentioned are in the description of the podcast, so go check them out. Thanks again for listening. I hope you enjoy this episode. And remember, if it's not about Kentucky, it ain't worth a hill of beans. This podcast is a production of the Cable Podcast Network.
In the pines, where the sun never shines, you'll shiver when the cold wind blows. There's a grave in the pines where the sun never shines. There's a grave that's shaded with the pine.
Welcome to the Land Between the Meadows, a history of Kentucky. Today I have with me, of course, is Mr. Pope. I'm Jamison Cable, and today we have a unique and different topic for you. As many things are shaped in Kentucky, they can influence the world. So what do we got, Mr. Pope?
Well, this certainly influenced the world and shapes our thinking. Moonshine, liquor, red liquor, and bourbon whiskey, an integral part of Kentucky history that we're going to be talking about today. It was said in Harlan County, Kentucky, that one horse could haul 10 times more value on its back in whiskey than it could in corn. And I like that. And Maggie Bailey, also from Harlan County, Kentucky, was once quoted in saying that she sold moonshine in order to provide for her families. So they're very noble ambition, making whiskey and selling it, providing for the children and school and all. Very noble profession. When we talk about American history and the whiskey industry, we go back to Pennsylvania, western Pennsylvania, in 1791 following the Revolutionary War. And we see that our young nation was really short of money after the Revolutionary War. And so were its people, particularly farmers.
Yeah.
The only way the government has of getting revenue and funds is by taxing. The new Congress, Continental Congress, decided that they would tax whiskey.
Yeah.
And the farmers were already having a hard time in western Pennsylvania, and they depended on the sale of whiskey, their extra rye that they grew in the fields, for income. And when the whiskey tax started in 1791, by 1794, farmers were totally exhausted.
Yeah.
And they led a huge rebellion against the United States government. Mm-hmm. Many of them had lost their farms because of being overtaxed. They were angry. Many of them had fought in the Revolutionary War, and they just didn't feel like they were being treated properly. So there was an uprising of farmers and distillers in western Pennsylvania in protest of the whiskey tax, which was enacted by the federal government. And George Washington, the commander during the Revolutionary War, of course, was ordered to take 3,000 trained soldiers to take out the leaders of the whiskey rebellion and try to restore order, which he did. It didn't really come to a lot of violence. They were armed with flintlock rifles and pitchforks and everything else, but he was able to quell the rebellion. But the so-called whiskey tax was the first tax imposed on a domestic product by the newly formed federal government, and obviously it wasn't very popular. What happened to these people? And this is, our broadcast here is about Kentucky history.
Well, that's my question: is how does this in Pennsylvania rolling into Kentucky?
Totally affects it. Okay. Totally affects Kentucky history, because many of these farmers have lost their farms, their homes, their families. So what do they do? Well, good old Ohio River right there in Pittsburgh, western Pennsylvania. They get on their flatboats, they grow up as groups, and they head down the Ohio River.
Yeah.
And they have their moonshine stills, or if you want to call them moonshine stills back then, their stills with them. And where they land is Kentucky.
Yeah.
Federal tax on whiskey is also in Kentucky, but many of them, Kentucky's geography, once again, plays a huge role.
Yeah.
First of all, going back, the need for whiskey, even with George Washington in the Revolutionary War, even at Valley Forge, he gave 4 drams or ounces of whiskey to every soldier every day, even though they didn't have clothing or bread or anything. He said it improved their health and attitude.
You got to keep them sharp.
And what happened was, it's even more interesting, is that, the common drink in colonial America was rum.
Yeah.
And rum came from the sugar and the molasses that was grown in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
So the British cut off the sources of rum and molasses by blockading their ports, so they couldn't make rum. So what they did was they turned to rye whiskey, which, if you know the northern colonies, the middle colonies, the bread colonies, southern colonies, the 13 colonies were divided up into geographic regions. The primary crop they grew in Pennsylvania was rye, and so they made rye whiskey.
Yeah.
So these people came down to Kentucky, and because of Kentucky's geography, it became very easily to grow corn, which they soon found out that corn whiskey was much better than rye.
Yeah.
It had more flavor, and they could make more from it per ounce. So that was very, very important, just because corn grew so well in Kentucky. Because Kentucky had the poorest road system, even after the Civil War, of all states in the United States, it was very hard for federal revenuers to even find people that were growing, who didn't want to be taxed, distilleries in Kentucky. So eastern Kentucky and Appalachia, eastern Tennessee as well, became favored places for distilling whiskey. Yeah. Plus, for some reason, Kentuckians had a taste, they loved it.
Well, now you're telling me that basically Kentucky has been founded by a bunch of drunks from Pennsylvania.
Well, that's about right. That's about a bunch of drunk farmers. That's about right. That's who our ancestors are. They came to Kentucky and they flowed down the Ohio River and they settled in places. And I want to read an excerpt about the Bourbon Empire by Reed Moulton Blur. And he was talking about, some of the famous people, like many people, they don't know exactly who started bourbon whiskey. Yeah. But Lewis Craig, who was a Baptist minister from the Traveling Church, is given a lot of credit for starting the first bourbon distillery in Kentucky. Yeah. And he started it, it's kind of interesting, he started it, the Traveling Church, which came from Virginia, because they didn't like the taxation and so forth, set it up already. They came right through Crab Orchard here where we are, and in the dead of winter, they settled between Crab Orchard and Lancaster. They built a temporary fortification on top of a hill. Yeah. And they were actually attacked by Indians, and several of them were killed. This church of like 500 people. And Lewis Craig was their leader. He was also a distiller. Yeah. He made whiskey. So he eventually settles, and the Traveling Church was in south of Lexington there, in South Elkhorn, and different places. But he established his church in what he called Lebanon. He named it Lebanon. Lebanon became Georgetown. They changed the name and named it after the first president, George Washington. Let me read a little bit here. Once Craig and his traveling church arrived in Kentucky, they founded a town called Lebanon, borrowing the name from the Old Testament called the Land of Milk and Honey. In 1790, the name was changed to Georgetown to honor the first U.S. president. The group was soon learned that the region was also a perfect kitchen for making whiskey. Each hill on the Kentucky horizon was a pale bluer echo of the one before. The rolling topography, resisting erosion and creating bottomlands with soil so rich that one settler compared it to black butter. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. From the very beginning, the bottomlands were legendary for growing corn. Hirsham Larrament, a Jesuit missionary living in Wisconsin a century before whites first started moving into Kentucky, was told by Indians that Kentucky's corn stalks were bigger than trees, the ears were 2 feet long, and the kernels were bigger than grapes. Wow. So that's
fertile land.
Fertile land, that's right. And they could be turning all this into whiskey. That, of course, was just a kind of exaggerated storytelling that seems to be part of Kentucky's DNA. Nevertheless, the corn did grow well here and was a practical choice for planting the state's newly settled rough acreage because it didn't need as much plowing as smaller grains like the rye we talked about in Pennsylvania and could grow faster than weeds. It exploded out of Kentucky's production 10 bushels of corn per acre, Kentucky land yielded 40.
Wow.
So the difference between the East and Kentucky.
Uh-huh.
This was more corn than any single family could consume, leaving surpluses to be distilled into, guess what? Whiskey that couldn't spoil, that wouldn't spoil, and could be used for barter or the inevitable drinking. It must have seemed impossible that the land could have ever been exhausted. That gives you, the typical farmer would grow more corn than they could use.
Yeah.
You remember, if we roll back to our last segment when we were talking about Benjamin Logan, and when he first came to what we now call Stanford, he put in a patch of corn and built a log cabin.
Yeah.
And with that, he went back to Virginia, which still was Virginia then, but over the mountains, and filed a claim because he could get 400 acres of land in Kentucky. Anybody could. It was a land grab if you would build a shelter and grow a patch of corn.
Yeah.
Remember, we laughed about he didn't even harvest it. I set my corn out. But they said the corn would grow faster than weeds in Kentucky. That's kind of interesting. But what do they do with that excess corn? They can't eat it all. They can't, necessarily feed it to hogs. And it's like the woman in Harlan County said, a horse could carry 40 times or 10 times the amount of value of whiskey than it could corn on its back. So, it kind of made sense. What you do with the excess corn that you grow.
As I said, the farmers would have two options, either to sell it and trade with it or drink it. So
that's right.
You're looking at a 50-50 chance of everybody's going to start drinking.
That's right. And when we talk about Elijah Craig, many people think that he started the actual bourbon, because bourbon's different than just corn whiskey or moonshine, in that bourbon is aged in charcoal, burned out barrels on the inside to give it flavor. And that's kind of important to note. Bourbon County, when it was originally named, was a part of Virginia, and it included 14 different Kentucky counties today.
Wow.
And it went all the way up and included Mason County and Maysville. A lot of times you talk about limestone liquors, where you're talking about spring waters, which Kentucky had more natural springs than any state in the United States. And that was just ideal, filtering the water. And limestone, of course, was the place that Simon Kenton founded, just south of Maysville. If you're talking about limestone whiskeys, are you talking about distilleries up in Mason County, what is today, or are you talking about filtered water through calcium-laden and rich in minerals, limestone, which, you could talk about both.
Yeah.
But bourbon, the name bourbon, they think came from Craig and others like him. They said his barn caught on fire and charred some of the white oak wood. Yeah. And so when he made them into staves, he, was short of wood, so he just filled it up. Yeah. And they stamped bourbon on it for that Bourbon County. So when it was sent down on rafts down the Ohio to the Mississippi, Natchez, New Orleans, Bourbon Street, people drank that, and the charcoal gave it a certain color, and the white oak gave it a certain flavor. And he also had aged his bourbon, which was something no one had done. And he made it from corn whiskey mash, which was better than the rye. And so people in New Orleans, the French and the Spanish, New Orleans was a French and Spanish settlement, they really loved it. And they would say, give me more of that bourbon, because the barrels were stamped with bourbon from Bourbon County. And that's how they think bourbon got its name. And then, obviously, if you look at the French Quarter in New Orleans, the major street's Bourbon Street. Oh, yeah. That's, they just loved it. Those French, drunk as wildcats, and Spanish, too.
You ever been to Bourbon Street?
I haven't. I've
it
always
smells
wanted to go.
terrible.
Does it really?
It's terrible. It smells so bad.
Wow. What does it smell like?
Well, everybody there is getting completely drunk and all that. So you can only imagine what is resting in the sewer pipes of Bourbon Street.
Yes. That the flowing to Kentucky farmers, when you look at them in the early days, we're talking 1790s. It became a tradition that geographically, I don't know if you realize this, but all rivers in Kentucky flow south. Yeah. And so that's Kentucky's connection with the South, its trading partner. That's why even when the Civil War broke out, to a certain extent, Kentucky had such rich ties with the southern states.
Because it was supplying them.
It was supplying them, and they were trading back and forth. Rivers don't flow up to Ohio. That was really important. And the Kentucky farmers, oftentimes every year or two would build a flatboat themselves out of logs. And in New Orleans, they have a lot of pine trees, and they don't have a lot of really good walnut and cherry, and yet it was a really booming port city, and where they also sold internationally to Paris and England and all over Spain. And they love the wood. So many Kentucky farmers would go out and cut walnut trees or big cherry trees and make their flatboats out of those logs. They would cure hams, which they also, fed hogs, and have country hams. They might have several barrels of bourbon whiskey they would put on there. Sometimes they even took pigs and live animals down, and they would put them on a flatboat, and let the current take them. Whether it was, the Dix River into the Kentucky and Kentucky into the Ohio, or Salt and all these different places. And they would float to New Orleans, which was a huge market, which paid premiums. They would take these longboats that were made out of this walnut and cherry and sell the boats, drag them up, and they would saw them up into lumber in New Orleans, whereas there was a huge market and get money for that as well. And then they would walk back on foot.
Oh, wow.
And it was pretty neat. A few years ago, I wrote a poem. I have a little book of poetry, which is not in circulation now. It's called Alone in a Dark House. It's got poems by me and by my daughter, Claire Larkin Pope. And I wrote one just about that business. Now, if I could, I'd like to read it to you.
Yes, that sounds great.
Yeah. It's called Dark Promises and Black Coffee. Often piled stones and notched bushes where there only lead along winding traces in hidden valleys where paradise waited in wooded glen or dark alluvial soil, where yellow poplar fell when sharpened axes cracked like pistols and cabins rose from solitude. Riding on names like Kentucky, Ohio, Licking, Big Sandy, and Salt, they floated flatboats on muddy water in the wake of dark promises, the black coffee of Natchez and New Orleans, salt pork, hemp, tobacco, and bourbon whiskey, as strong as the limestone-born corn that brewed their muted dreams, and filled their homespun pockets with the old rhythm they sung of silver and gold. And there they were again, as seasons turned and the wind stroked sweet whispers on the lips of bluebells and windy knolls, there where, in the dark of the night, women cried softly in feathered beds and forever played games of growing old.
Very good.
Well,
very nice. That's very good.
Well, thank you. It's a muted dreams.
Yeah. Well, it connects a lot to...
It does what we're talking
yes.
about.
Yeah. And I find it so interesting how you don't... Well, it just goes to our original point of this whole podcast about how things connect and how much Kentucky connected to New Orleans.
Absolutely.
And then New Orleans would then spread from internationally.
Here we go again, our country hymns. Even if you talk about Abraham Lincoln as a boy, one of the first jobs he got outside of Kentucky when he was about 14 years old is that he was hired by his neighbor, he and another fella, to take a load of choked pigs on a flatboat down to New Orleans. And during that time, he stopped somewhere, I don't know if it was Nashville or Natchez, while they pulled up to shore. He had a bunch of pigs on the flatboat. You can imagine that. And they were having a slave auction.
Yeah.
And he witnessed that as a young boy, about them tearing babies from their mother's arms and putting them up for sale and crying.
Yeah.
And he said that if he swore at that point, if he ever had the ability or chance in the rest of his life to amend slavery, to end it, that he would devote his life to doing that. Yeah. And that was while he was on a longboat to New Orleans.
At 14 years old.
14 years old.
I mean, shaped the entire country.
The evolution of the bourbon industry, many people say, there's a timeline. They say this happened and that happened. But, it was sort of an evolution of, improvements and different people making connections. And the first commercial distillery was in Louisville, Kentucky, again connected to the Falls of the Ohio. When we go back and talk about Elijah Craig, the Baptist minister, in 1789, we talked about him opening that distillery in Georgetown. Later on, they produced bourbon called Heaven Hill, and that was named in honor of Elijah Craig. Yeah,
wow.
The Heaven Hill distilleries. I thought that was...
Because he was a minister?
Minister.
Wow.
Yeah, Heaven Hill. We go on and we can talk, about Prohibition and moonshine revenuers and Kentucky and the back roads and Rockcastle, where you're from, and eastern Kentucky and Harlan County. And do you know that outrunning the revenuers and cars and so forth and delivering whiskey is what started NASCAR racing?
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's right. because they wanted to have fast cars and they would race, but the original were moonshine people. It's also kind of sad talking about whiskey and bourbon. These are people that are trying to escape paying taxes, the moonshiners. They teamed up in Kentucky and in the South with the Ku Klux Klan.
Oh, yeah.
It's really sad. And the reason for that is that, if you had a still, both in small towns operating out the chimney of your fireplace or in real remote places where there were no roads and so forth that was hidden, like we oftentimes think of, there were people that would snitch on you to the federal government, said they're operating a still down there, some of the do-gooders. And so they teamed up with the Klan, and the Klan would treat them just like they did people they didn't like. They'd burn crosses in their yard, they might burn their house down, try to drive them out of the community. Threaten them because they were telling on people that were doing moonshine. So they linked up with the Ku Klux Klan, a lot of them did.
Oh, okay.
And became a civil organization to get snitchers.
Yeah,
people would snitch on them. I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, that is.
To talk about. Bourbon whiskey can be made anywhere, but the most famous is Kentucky. And again, the limestone streams are so important. The state sits atop vast deposits of what's called blue limestone, which filters out, like hard iron in the water and imparts sweet-tasting calcium and magnesium. And you can go to to this day, you can go to an open stream in Kentucky, and it will taste better than 90% of the tap water you get.
Oh, yeah. I can agree to that.
You go out here in the hall and drink that and prove that. Kentucky has the ideal climate, also to age bourbon. Yeah. In the warm weather, the barrels expand, and the whiskey or the bourbon goes into the soft white oak wood and gets a certain flavor. And then in the cold winter, it does just the opposite. It brings out a sugar out of the charcoal and the white oak and puts it into the bourbon. Yeah. And also the charcoal gives it color. But it's not just the streams is what I'm trying to say. Yeah. It's not just that. It's the climate. While bourbon is aging, the warm, the hot summers, the sweaty summers, and the cold winters kind of makes the bourbon what it is. Yeah, and I thought that was kind of interesting,
unique. That's why, or that it works so well to have Kentucky bourbon. Now, back in our previous episode, you said I think that the fire that it was an accident. It was an accidental fire.
Right. It was an accidental fire. His barn burned down.
Yeah, his barn burned down.
Part of it did.
And so that's once again the uniqueness that his barn burns down. Instead of throwing away, he just keeps it, and it ages and then becomes, bourbon, and then he sells it down the river.
That's right, and ages. Yeah. And a lot of these immigrants, that came into Kentucky, the Cabins Right Act, we talked about the Corn Patch. It's called the Corn Patch and the Cabins Right Act of 1776. And that's what Benjamin Logan got a hold of. And you could, claim 400 acres of any of this great Kentucky land.
And as long as you planted some corn.
That was the thing, and that made it homestead, made you not just be running all over the country. And a lot of these immigrants that came into Kentucky were drawn here were German, obviously through Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania Deutsch, the Germans, and Scotland, and Scotch-Irish.
There you go. So,
and that's who. That's
all well-known alcoholics.
All the well-known alcoholics. That's our ancestors. That's true. Yeah, that's true. And they brought technology from Europe as well, from their homeland. But like we talked about, rye was the plentiful grain in Pennsylvania and Maryland. But when they came over the Appalachians, the corn grew so well, and it was better instead of rye, and it made a better, bar-tasting, smoother whiskey.
With what we've said so far, Elijah Craig is given the credit to starting.
He is.
Not necessarily if that is like 100% accurate, but that's what most people.
That's what most people. That is correct. Right. It's not a definite, but he definitely did that, and he made a lot of good whiskey that people really like. Yeah.
Baptist ministry.
Yeah.
The irony is, as far as time frame, I know Elijah Craig was around what time was he in Kentucky?
1789.
1789, and then so when would we say? I mean, it's hard to. This is probably hard to determine, and we would have to find out. But when, so if we said 1789 is when bourbon was so to say invented or created, whiskey that's probably way back.
It goes back in Europe.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. That probably in Europe and some.
And a lot of the whiskey was made with rye, like we said. And they even tried oats and barley and everything else. It had different effects.
But then, once it came over here, that's when bourbon was created.
Sour mash.
Yeah.
You don't have a bottle on you, do you?
No, not at school here.
Yeah. I've been fighting a cold the last week, and I could probably use a dram or two, just like Washington's good soldiers.
Yeah, well,
They got 4 ounces every
so
day. You know, where they had no food or bread.
You're getting your whiskey
shoes
shot.
on their feet, improve their condition.
Yeah, which I assume
their
too,
attitude.
with that, George Washington was probably did lighten their nerves a little bit.
I'm sure.
Maybe cheer them up a little bit.
Yeah, that's right.
He had some sort of strategy behind
Happy
it. I'm sure
starving.
he didn't want them all stumbling drunk. But
yeah. Well, the British did the same thing.
Yeah.
It was really common to
Yeah.
the military.
Mm-hmm.
They give them all a dram of whiskey every day, or rum usually was the drink, which made them feel better.
Well, like my grandma, she always had I assume she probably still does, like a bottle of something for a cold. In that case, take a shot of whatever it may be, for a cold, and I guess it may have worked, it may not have worked at times, I don't know. But I was never given a shot of whiskey for a cold, but I guess an older kind of remedy that people had. I also was thinking while you were talking about this, and you were talking about how so many people were kind of making a living with their excess corn, selling it in order to get whatever they made it
cash
need.
money.
Yeah,
it was cash money. You don't have any cash flow coming in. You're raising hogs, and
they're trying to survive.
They're feeding themselves. It's a homestead.
Yeah,
they're eating the corn or feeding it to their animals, and they have no money. They have to do something to sell eggs or sell bourbon or something to get a little cash money or trade with it. And every community, had it. These jugs, just like Crab Orchard and Lebanon, Kentucky, Sunnyside Saloon. They were, they're highly collected, the stoneware that these people brewed and sold, the stoneware jugs with labels on them of the town they came from. I'm in the antique business, and I'm telling you, some of them, I've seen some bring $2,000 and $3,000 that are rare. Hollering back to the good old days when they had taverns in towns and they advertised.
Every town had a tavern.
Every town had a tavern, just about. In the smaller towns, they're more rare today. They're more sought after. Some of the Louisville jugs, for instance, there's all kinds of distilleries in Louisville. The first commercial distillery in Kentucky was in Louisville.
Yeah. Well, I
believe it's Evan Williams, which is also the name of a whiskey. Yeah, I'm told.
I've seen it in passing.
Yeah, I've heard about it. Yeah. The glasses clink.
I was thinking, as far as the time period goes, we talked about Simon Kenton and Daniel Boone so far, and we mentioned in those podcasts about how they were not a fan of that they did not really hold with alcohol of any sort. They were more about they wanted to, I guess, be more sober and not have any kind of thing. Would you think these people that were coming down the river from Pennsylvania,
bunch of drunks,
lighting fires in the middle of the woods, getting attacked by Native Americans,
getting scalped, wondering why, not in control of their faculties.
Simon Kenton and Daniel Boone and others that were frontiersmen.
They were not known as drinkers.
Yeah, and that helped them out probably to stay alive in many cases.
And many of them were probably killed. You went the other way. Yeah. Let's party down. That's the end of it. Just
sailing
like today.
down the river, singing
I'm sure.
Drinking songs.
Merrily. And the crash of a flintlock or a thud of an arrow.
Yeah. Sober up real quick, I guess.
Yeah, try to. Yeah. That's the way it was, though. That's accurate. We're all a bunch of drunk immigrants sailing down the river, getting picked off by Indians. That's the way
wondering
it was.
Why.
Yeah, wondering why. Wondering what hit them. Grow corn as big as berries. Kernels as big as berries. It's that limestone water.
It is unique that the
caramelized sugar that came between the white oak barrels and the charcoal. Caramelized.
Wow.
It's a caramel color. Caramelized
it is,
sugar.
Yeah.
Boy, it sounds good. You got a liquor store in Crab Orchard?
No. Well, that takes a. We were
what
talking.
The hell? I'm out of here. That's the end of this podcast.
That's interesting too. You bring that up.
I got a dog out in the garden.
As far as we talked about prior, I would say as early as 1900 or 1800. From that point on, there was a tavern in about every town, every small town you could think of. But then during the Prohibition,
Right.
Everybody went
Then it really
went
boomed.
dry. The towns went dry, but then the alcohol really
moonshiners,
boomed.
That's right, and that's the NASCAR.
That's when you started getting the moonshine and all that sort of.
There's a funny term you talk about this bourbon whiskey in small towns and moonshine and everything. Some people called it puker slop because it'd make you puke.
Yeah.
They called it puker slop.
Yeah.
I thought that was funny. You want some of that puker slop?
Oh.
Make you puke.
I could see how that could happen.
I could see that too. I've been told that that's the way it is. Some of my friends told me that.
Not from personal experience.
No, I have a friend that told me that when they were in college, they drank a lot of puker slop. It got them through college. They married and became very unhappy. They were under the influence at the time.
Then though, with Prohibition, once it was repealed or done away with, I guess so. The option was given for towns to be wet or dry. Is that how that went?
It still is today.
And now, I mean, a lot of the towns around here, every county around Lincoln.
That's right. But when you look at Kentucky, and I'm glad you're saying that.
Yeah.
I've made this analogy that many of the communities that were German, that came from Pennsylvania, like we talked about from the Whiskey Rebellion, they legalized alcohol. Almost every German community because it was part of their culture. But you get the English and the Scottish and the Irish, and a lot of them, believe it or not, voted it out. But the Germans, the German communities, you look along the Ohio River, Louisville, Maysville, Augusta, all up and down the Ohio River, and even on the Ohio
Cincinnati,
side, Cincinnati, German.
There you go.
Liquor. Prohibition. What the hell it'd say? What's that? Where's that coming from? And even if you go to Europe today, and I've traveled in Europe, and I've in France and Ireland and different places, and I said, well, where are you from? And I said, well, Kentucky, and I'd say, in Kentucky they won't sell alcohol, and they go, what? They get real serious. Where's that coming from? I mean, they don't even understand it. And I remember multiple people telling me, you mean you live what's dry mean? You live in a dry county? What does that mean?
At this point, though, with Lincoln County, all the surrounding counties, I think, have some sort of wetness. So a lot of places here recently have
puker slop. Recently, it's changing.
Have been getting the puker slop.
Why? Why is it changing?
Good question. Money,
of course.
Yeah.
You can't operate a good restaurant and make money unless you serve alcohol. I mean,
true.
A lot of people, I'm sure, will take exception to that, but commercially,
Yeah.
around town halls, they all
Yeah.
say that because, people want to drink beer, and that's where they make their money.
Yeah.
Is selling alcohol. It's not from
Because
the food.
and they can tax it up.
That's right, and they tax it up. They charge things for alcohol licenses,
Yep.
small towns.
Yep.
I mean, that's what did it. I mean, you one right after another.
Yep.
It's a, it's an
it's a
economic
driving
base.
force.
It's that it's that taxes again on cigarettes and tobacco. On sins.
Yeah.
The taxes of sin. They oftentimes call it. They tax that puker slop. That's a funny word.
It is.
I like that puker slop. It may have been pucker slop, but I always called it puker slop.
Puker slop. There you go.
Pucker up or puke, either one. Take your choice.
Pick your poison.
Yeah, pick your poison. That's right. So that's interesting. Tying into economics. And I see it so clearly. I don't know if the listeners do, but we go back to Stanford. We talked about Benjamin Logan. Planting an acre of corn, getting 400 acres of land.
Yeah.
And then you got the corn. What do you do with it? Do you feed it to hogs? You can only eat so much.
Make something out of your resource. You have a resource.
It's too heavy.
Yeah.
There's no roads. You're using the rivers, which Kentucky had. That was one of the reasons Kentucky didn't develop their roads because of the tremendous river systems everywhere. That was the transportation. It was with the Native Americans that we talked about earlier as well.
Yeah.
Their villages were on rivers.
Yeah.
That's just economics.
Yeah.
It's the way small towns have changed, and because of economics.
Yeah.
Money has driven, Here's a
question
That's why we talked even the last time about settlement.
Yeah.
Where'd they settle in? Take the bluegrass.
Yeah.
They all poured in over the Wilderness Road led into Mercer County, Harrisburg, good land, or came down from limestone to bluegrass, by floating on the rivers, where did they sell their whiskey? New Orleans, the rivers, or, you know. I mean, it
Memphis
just
was on the river.
Memphis, oh my gosh, drunk in Memphis, you know. I mean, it's
no
just
offense
there.
to those listening to Memphis.
No offense to men. You suck, but you know. So does Tennessee. While we're at it, there goes the podcast.
Easy.
Settle down, easy boy.
So
puke or slop.
So real quickly, what about the Native Americans? Would they?
Oh my goodness.
Would they trade with the bourbon or trade with those, or were they against it? Or
that's another story.
Another
the ones
story,
that had
another day.
sense were against it.
Yeah.
You know, because they had to genetically, you know, they the firewater get them really drunk. And, you know, so many great Native America, just like immigrants and everyone else, was ruined by alcohol. You know, everybody. Certain percentage of people have genes that cause them to be alcoholics, and it's not funny. It is not funny. And you know, and I've been told many times, if I drank, and I hardly ever drink anymore. I used to drink a lot when I was an elementary teacher. But I was really careful. If I was in mixed company with someone, I would have offered in my house to anybody unless I knew them really well, because I didn't want to encourage that. I really didn't. And because I've seen, and most families have seen, that we're in very serious times now. Drugs and alcohol both. Affects people's lives horribly.
Yes, and that's one thing too.
So it's no good.
Point out to listeners, this is by no means encouraging anybody to go out and drink.
It's not. Horse racing, cigarette smoking, and bourbon whiskey. Is some of the roots of Kentucky. Based on sin. Based on sin. Even Elijah Craig. His congregation, after he got really started cranking out the bourbon, they came to him and they said, we don't see how you can serve God and serve the whiskey bottle too. And it was a real problem. And they pointed that out to him later on, and they told him basically to make a choice.
One or the other,
And here's the founder of all these great churches,
pumping out whiskey,
pumping out that whiskey,
Yeah, that's very it's a very unique situation.
And you could pay your taxes in colonial America in Kentucky with jugs of whiskey or tobacco.
Really?
You didn't have cash money, and if you got fined in court for problems, they'd say, give us 5 jugs of whiskey or give us 40 pounds of tobacco for shooting up the tavern.
Which that makes sense. I mean, it was 19 or not 19. It was 17.
But anyway.
Anyway, enough about money.
But another thing, the Civil War and bourbon whiskey, the Union. Where does the government get money for the war? Taxing. Whiskey. And so in 1861, the federal government increased taxes and broke down. And that really started the moonshine industry. And again, you talk about the Klan. That was one of the reasons that they joined with the Klan, because most of the Klan were Southern. And they were against taxing because they were using that money to fund the Northern military, the Northern Army. And so you can see how
it was a win-win.
It was a win-win situation for everybody. Which was a horrible thing. Obviously, still you can see why they would join forces in certain areas. Anybody who squealed on them to burn them out.
Yeah. All right. So with that wrapping up, anything else to add about bourbon?
My mind shot.
We talked about
puker slop.
The puker. We talked about the bourbon industry and
the need for it if you're an elementary teacher.
and in Kentucky, and how it has had a big influence in Kentucky. There's the Bourbon Trail that people come and visit all the time. We probably should have reached out to them to see if they had any events, just for the relative discussion here.
That's the biggest thing in Kentucky right now.
Again,
and bourbon's famous all over the world.
And
it's just bringing in tons of money. Do you see where the Chinese are trying to retaliate and tax bourbon?
Really?
Yes. And they've got a growing. China's just can't get enough bourbon. I mean, they're just drunk all the time. The Chinese
so there's many of them. There's loads of them over there.
Millions, billions of them. And they all want a glass of bourbon.
There you go.
That's the drink of choice now.
The influence of Kentucky.
Cause and effect relationships. I've talked about this before. The white oak trees in Kentucky are disappearing. They're the main tree in our forest. They're going up. I talked to a hauler, and he's going up into West Virginia and cutting down white oak trees and bringing them back to Lebanon, Kentucky, where the big barrel staves are. Because they're disappearing. They're paying such high prices for it. They're probably the most profitable tree in the forest now. Not walnut or cherry, but white oak.
Wow.
Because of the bourbon barrels and the expansion. Both for wine, France is buying them over here. White oak barrels, and so is the bourbon industry.
Wow. Wow,
and they
that's
can't even
interesting.
cut them around here.
Yeah.
I was just going down the road looking at some Amish that had cut down some trees, and the logs were 1 foot
Wow.
in across.
Not even.
They're just babies.
Yeah.
And they're laying out in the fields.
Wow.
The white oak getting ready to haul them out.
Huh.
Because there's such a demand for them.
Yeah, wow, that's another interesting take there.
Oh yeah.
But again, people can abuse alcohol.
You talk and
for
I'll
sure.
pour a drink.
Yeah. People can abuse alcohol. So in no way are we encouraging people to
Absolutely
go out there
not.
and get drunk and all that kind of stuff. And alcohol has ruined many people's lives.
Do as we say and not as we do.
Yeah. But anyways, that is I guess that concludes our discussion on the bourbon or the bourbon industry in Kentucky. So it's time for our new segment, our history around you in Kentucky, however you want to call it.
Which is everywhere.
Which is everywhere.
So many interesting things, places to go and things to see.
So many. And
all season long.
All season long. They got stuff going on all over that you can check out.
Christmas at Fort Herod.
Yes, Christmas at Fort Herod. Ashland, the Henry Clay Estate, are having some events for Christmas as well.
In Lexington.
Have you been there, Mr.
Oh,
Pope?
yes.
Great place to go.
Oh, it is fantastic. They got some gardens and history, and Henry Clay is one of the most, if not the most interesting
Kentucky
politician.
Yes.
Yeah.
Ashland, the Henry Clay Estate, they're having a Polar Express story time on December 7th at 10 a.m. And also, they will be having their candlelight tours on December 7th, 12th, and 14th from 5:30 to 7:30. Last guests will be admitted at 7. If anyone is interested in purchasing a ticket or tickets, they can find more information on their website, which is www.henryclay.org. Now, the candlelight tours are an open house event where guests can walk through the mansion at your own leisure, and there will be employees there, workers there, that will answer questions if you have those kind of questions. This year, they're featuring the inaugural ball gowns of the Kentucky First Ladies and Governor Martha Lane Collins. So something very interesting to check out as far as history goes.
Yeah.
Many events are coming to Ashland Henry Clay Estates in 2020, but we'll talk about those in a later podcast. Also, the Fort Boonesboro is having their 18th century Christmas at the fort, and it is on Friday 6 to 9 and Saturday 1 to 4.
Boy.
If you want to check that out as well.
That would
So
really be
a lot of good
interesting.
stuff going on.
You blend history with holidays. It's great.
Oh yeah, very interesting stuff. If you want to experience those kind of,
Kentucky's so wonderful.
it's awesome. It's the best.
Awesome, man. It is the best.
All right. With anything else, Mr. Pope, to add?
Heritage of drunk Germans.
The drunk Germans.
That's what we learned today.
Yeah, that's what you learned. All right. Anything else?
No, sir.
All right. See you. Thanks for listening.
Squirrel hunting. Gonna have a
Squirrel
drink.
hunt. All right. We would like to thank all of our listeners out there who support the show by listening to each and every episode. We couldn't do it without you. From all across the U.S., we thank you for the support. If you would like to join the conversation and give your thoughts on this podcast and other episodes, join the Cable Podcast Network group on Facebook. If you are enjoying the content of this podcast, consider visiting anchor.fm/themeadows KYhistory/support. You can also find this link in the show's description, or check out the Cable Podcast Network Patreon page. If you want to help this podcast grow in other ways, like the Cable Podcast Network page on Facebook and share our links on all social media outlets. You can find the Cable Podcast Network on Facebook, Tumblr, and Twitter. If you're listening to this podcast on iTunes, give us a positive review and leave a comment. Thanks again for all your support.